Good morning. Welcome to our class again together. We are continuing our study of the Gospel of John. Today we are in John chapter 12 and 13. And so we're going to begin something that will take a couple of weeks to get through, but I think it'll be beneficial to all of us. Let me ask you the question, what would you say or do if you only had 1 week left on this earth? Now, that's a difficult question to answer. We might want to say we want to do everything. We want to do everything we've missed. But that's probably not reasonable. You have to describe now what's the most important thing. Who would you talk to? What would you tell them? What would you want to be remembered about and for? Would you have them remember after you're gone that you couldn't remind them of in any other way? That's exactly the situation Jesus is facing in this. For you see, one of the things that's happened is when we move into John chapter 12, we are now compressed in time to a single week. By the time we get to the end of the week, the death, burial, and resurrection will have been accomplished. So Jesus has this moment, this precious moment, to say and do what the disciples need him to say and do right now. And I think those are the things that we need to hear at the same time, because that's what makes our Christian life worth living, and it gives us the direction in which we need to go. And so the cross was coming into great focus. Before, it had been out there in a general sense. But now Jesus is going to come and start saying, it's going to happen, it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And therefore, you need to know this. And so what was fuzzy for the previous 11 chapters becomes quite clear as it's revealed. So what's being revealed that we need to be able to see today and that every disciple of Jesus needs to be able to see? Number one, the glory was revealed. You may remember that we have talked about the concept of glory on several occasions. When Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, he did not go immediately because he said, so that the glory of God may be shown. The same was said about healing the blind man. It was not that he had sinned or his parents had sinned, and this was for the glory of God, that it might be made manifest. So you begin to have these little breadcrumbs along the way about a glory that was coming. But in this lesson, it becomes very real and very clear of what it is. That word glory has its original foundations in commerce. It really meant weight. Instead of having coins and bills, they had precious metals, gold, silver, things like that. And the way you determined value was to put them on a two-pan scale and put so much against one of them, and if it weighed this much, it was worth this much money in our perspective. If it was heavier, it was worth a lot more. The heavier it got, the more valuable it became. And so that whole concept is what glory comes from. This is something that is the most precious, that is the most valuable, that is the most sought after of anything in existence. And so we see it coming to light in various ways. It's usually given to the concept of God. God has glory. God has importance. And so, for instance, when you come to Exodus chapter 24, you come to Mount Sinai. Moses goes up on the mountain. And Exodus 24 tells us that the glory of the Lord dwelt on Mount Sinai because it said, the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. They saw this flame on top of the mountain. They said, that's the glory of God. The presence of God is here. The power of God is here. You just imagine that concept and the image of what it conjures up. Fire is a powerful and frightening thing. If that's the glory of God, then this is a powerful and frightening thing in our presence. When you get to Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah gets his call as a young man to be a prophet. He does it while he's in the midst of worshiping in the temple. So in Isaiah chapter 6, we're said, it's told to us that in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. God inhabits every part of the earth. It is full of his glory. So we kind of figure out that glory is the full expression of God so that you know who he is and what he wants. It is the power and presence of God. When the glory of God is there, God is there. So it is that when Jesus comes, he begins to talk about the glory. And so when we come to John chapter 12, we meet a situation we see in other gospels. That's called the triumphal entry. Jesus rides into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, the foal of a colt, as some versions say, and he is proclaimed with adulation by the crowds as he comes in. This has triggers in the minds of people of Scripture. They remember the Scripture that comes from Zechariah chapter 9. Fear not, daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt. It was hard to miss that if this was the king that was coming, he's coming in the right way. But John tells us this. In John chapter 12, he says, his disciples did not understand these things at first. They didn't put these things together. But when Jesus was glorified, they remembered these things had been written about him and had been done to him. There is a moment in which he is going to be glorified, and it's still yet to come here, but it says they remembered when he was. This all came together when the picture was put together in the final form. Like the puzzle, with the last puzzle piece, you finally realize this is what the picture really looks like. That's going to happen here. Jesus, though, goes on in a few verses later, and he says in verse 23, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Now, the concept of the hour to come has been prevalent in John, as we've seen as well, at least 4 or 5 times. He keeps saying, my hour is not yet arrived. It is not yet my hour. It is not yet my time. There was this timetable that had to take place. It seemed that God had said there's going to be the right propitious moment to make something happen. But before, it's never here. Now Jesus says, now the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Well, in what way is that going to happen? If it's going to happen now, what's going to take place right now, immediately? He goes on to explain, truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Whoever loves his life loses it, and whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. There is something about this putting the seed in the ground and letting it die, and letting it come back to life in a bigger form and with much fruit, that this an analogy about what is going to happen to him. Jesus is going to die. In fact, another verse here says, when I am lifted up from the earth. Jesus is going to die on a cross. He's going to be buried in a grave. He'll be dead. The death will allow something to happen. And when he rises again, he'll bear much fruit. You can see exactly what's happening here. The glory is going to come at the death, the burial, and the resurrection, for there you find something out. Remember what John started with. He said, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. When you look at the cross, when you look at the death, burial, and resurrection that we're going to in a couple of weeks, when you see that in full face, what you understand is when you see Jesus, you've seen God. In fact, Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. The death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus tells us everything about the impressive power of God. He loves so much, he sacrifices so much so that we might live. That's the glory. We have beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. He tells you the truth and gives you the grace. It is God incarnate, as John would say. That's not the only thing that's revealed in these chapters. The second thing that's revealed is exactly the polar opposite. Instead of the glory being revealed, evil is also revealed. Now, we've had this hazy look at various things. We've seen the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin, and I put all those kind of things together under the format of the Jewish leaders, because I think that's the umbrella that you have to use. But the Jewish leaders, through the whole study we've been dealing with, have started off by opposition to want to arrest him, to wanting to stone him, to now they're wanting to kill him. And you never hear what's going on. You kind of get the idea. In fact, we know because we keep reading the end of the story, so we don't have to worry about it. But this is about something else. Why in the world do these rulers want to do this? Well, you begin to see how they are exposed in these chapters much more clearly than before. It says in John chapter 12, beginning in verse 9, and when the large crowds of the Jews learned that Jesus came there, meaning to Jerusalem, they came not only on account of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priest made plans to put Lazarus to death as well, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. Not only did the Jewish leaders want to kill Jesus, they wanted to kill the innocent man Lazarus simply because he had been raised from the dead, and it would eliminate a political problem for them. There's nothing worse in the face of evil than people doing wrong because it's politically good for them. It happens all the time. It was not moral then, it's not moral now. It will always be sinful one way, or it will always be wicked one way or another. And so these leaders now, you see clearly what they're trying to do. They're trying to extinguish everything that has to do with Jesus. And it tells us why as well. John chapter 12, beginning verse 37 says, though he had done so many signs before them, they still did not believe in him, so that the word spoken of by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. Lord, who has believed what he heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Therefore they could not believe, for again Isaiah said, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts, lest they see with their eyes and understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. Isaiah said these things because he saw the glory and spoke of him. Nevertheless, not many even of the authorities believed in him, but for fear of the Pharisees, they didn't confess it, lest they be put out of the synagogue. You begin to hear through the voice of Isaiah being quoted here, the reason evil existed in their hearts. It was a heart problem. This was not a political problem. It never has been a political problem. It's always been a heart problem. They choose not to believe because by believing, they have to give up something. That's why a lot of people don't believe. It will cost them too much, and they don't want to do that. But here you see the blackened, darkened heart of men who so much refused to believe that they would execute Jesus and Lazarus to satisfy their own needs. But then we come to the man Judas. In the Gospel of John, Judas doesn't really occupy much of a place until you get to this chapter. Then suddenly he becomes star front and center. He's never mentioned before now. And so here we have Judas. Judas, we don't know a lot about him. Some say that he must have been a zealot who was looking for the revolution to come to overthrow the Roman government. Some believe that he was nothing more than a common crook. We don't know a lot about Judas, outside of the fact he was either from Iscariot or he was an assassin. It could mean either one, by the way. But Judas plays a peculiar part in this story, as we will see. Jesus is instituting the Lord's Supper. Now, in the Gospel of John, you never read of the detail of the institution of the Lord's Supper like you do in the Synoptics. You know, in the Synoptics, there is this idea. He sits down and he explains, this is the bread and this is what it means. This is the cup, the fruit of the vine. This is what it means. And so there's this step-by-step instruction. John doesn't have any of that. John assumes that. He assumes his readers already understand all of that because he just sets the scene and goes on. And so part of all of this begins by looking at who Judas is in a different circumstance. John chapter 12. John chapter 12 opens with an event that is referred to in chapter 11. And yet it's interesting what it says here. In John chapter 12, you have Mary, the sister of Lazarus, and she takes this very expensive flask of this very expensive ointment. She breaks the flask, where it's unusable again. She takes this ointment and anoints the feet of Jesus, and the aroma fills the entire space. And that's where we meet Judas. So it says, but Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he about who was to betray him, said, why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? And John says he said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And having charge of the money back, he used to help himself what to put into it. One of the things we find out was that you had everyday ordinary expenses you had to pay for, so they had this small, what we call petty cash, if you will. And the one who kept the cash register, the petty cash bag, was Judas. And Judas pilfered. He didn't have to account for anything, so every once in a while he'd take money out, put it in his own pocket, and keep it. He had no regard for the disciple group. So you establish early what he's like. He's looking out for himself. He doesn't care about the rest of the disciples. He doesn't care about Jesus. He cares about getting what he can get when he can get it. Which brings us to chapter 13. There, when Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper, the major idea for John is not the Lord's Supper, but the betrayal that will take place. And so it says, after saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. One of the disciples, whom Jesus loved, was reclining at the table at Jesus' side. So Simon Peter motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So that disciple, meaning Peter, leaning back against Jesus, said to him, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, it is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it. So when he had dipped the morsel, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. Then, after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him. And Jesus said to him, what you're going to do quickly. Here we see a man on the verge of doing the most despicable thing that could be thought of, betraying Jesus so he could be killed. Judas, it says, was sitting with Jesus when he received the morsel of bread that had been dipped in the sop, then it says, and Satan entered into him. You see, Satan enters to places that are unguarded and whose doors are open. It is apparent from the life of Judas. The door to his heart and his life was open. So Satan had no barrier at all. He just entered in. And he began the plot to betray Jesus. And then, just one little statement in John. So after receiving the morsel of bread, he immediately went out, and it was night. Now I want you to pay attention to something. This was already a supper, and by Jewish custom, suppers didn't take place until after sundown. It was already night. You already knew that. You didn't have to be told it. And yet John says, and it was night. Why does he say that? Because Jesus is the one who gives the light. And those who have no light walk in darkness. It was night. It was night in the heart and soul of Judas, who had nothing but evil on his mind, only headed for betrayal. He was in the dark in more ways than the physical way. It was night. There are probably times we need to ask ourselves, how dark is our spirits right now? Is it night? It should be an indicator of something wrong. But for Judas, he goes out because it is night. John told us in John chapter 1 and verse 5, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The darkness would not overcome the light. Instead, Jesus would overcome the darkness. But here we see Jesus in one room, Judas outside of the room, and it was night. And so we see evil as it creeps along Jerusalem's dark streets, looking to the darkest deed of all of history. And you see evil face to face. But the third thing that's revealed, at least for our lesson today, is what discipleship really is. Jesus has never said a lot about discipleship in the Gospel of John. In fact, it is assumed, I suppose, rather than stated. You pick up the story and you've got people following him. You've got Peter and Andrew, and you've got Bartholomew, and you've got Philip, and you've got these men, and it looks like they just kind of join in and are kind of following along. And doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of demand on them, and they're trying to learn, and they're seeing all these things, they're seeing all these miracles, and they're trying to make sense out of all of them. And so it comes to this point, and Jesus says, now that you've seen all this, let's talk about what it means to you. John chapter 12 and verse 26, it says, if anyone serves me, he must follow me, and where I am, there my servant must be also. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him. He talks about that the one who follows him serves him. And now that would be very simple to say, I think we do. But he has something else in mind, something bigger than that, as shown in chapter 13. Chapter 13 has a background to it. I need to paint you the background briefly. When we eat, we sit down at a table. We sit in a chair, our feet are on the floor. That was not true in the first century, especially among the Jews. Instead, they reclined at the table. They laid backward on a couch where their head and their arms were close to the table, but the bodies were out. It doesn't look anything like Da Vinci's Last Supper, I guarantee, even though that's the Renaissance picture of things. Instead, it was something else. And you just imagine you're eating, and around the table you got men with bare feet who've been walking for all day long, and how lack of appetizing that would be. I mean, it's just not very appetizing at all. Think about all these dirty feet around the table. And so it was customary that when someone would come in to eat, usually the servant who was on the lowest rung of the ladder, He drew the short straw and he had to wash feet. He had the smelliest, dirtiest job there was. And it's kind of like at the end of the parade, the guy who is there to scoop up after the horses. That's the same idea as the guy who has to wash the feet. He has nothing, he has no status at all. And he has the dirtiest job possible, something that if you can advance, you want to get out of that role pretty fast. So they're reclining at the table. They've all come in, they've laid down on their couches, and everybody knows what the protocol is, but the answer is, it's not my job. So everybody's waiting for something to happen that's never going to happen. And so Jesus gets up. He takes a basin, pours water into it from the pitcher, puts a towel around his neck, and begins to go around the room, bathing feet, wiping with the towel until they're clean. From one to another, until he gets to Peter, and Peter will not have any of that. He will not let his Lord be demeaned such a way. Now, he's not going to do it, but he's not going to let Jesus do it either. You're not washing my feet. He's full of pride and arrogance at that point. Jesus says, if you don't let me wash your feet, you have no part of me. And at that point, he knows he's either going to be in or he's going to be out at this very minute if he doesn't let Jesus wash his feet. So he starts going overboard. Well, wash my feet and my head also. And Jesus says, you don't need a bath. We just need to wash your feet. He finishes. He goes back to where the basin was, replaces it where it was, hangs the towel, comes back to the table. And now he says, I want to show you what that was about. When he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so that I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought also to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do just as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Jesus says, now do you understand what I'm trying to do? This is not about washing feet. This is about something bigger than that. He said, I have given you an example. It's a word that means a writing example. For instance, when I was in first grade, my first grade teacher was a woman named Mrs. Gardner. And Mrs. Gardner had around the room above the chalkboard this strip of paper that had a top line, a bottom line, and a middle dotted line. And on those were the characters of the alphabet, capital and small letters. And they had arrows that showed how you drew them. And so if you looked at there, it would show you exactly how to write that letter. And as long as you wrote underneath that, you could duplicate the letter. That's the word. If you'll do what I did, if you will duplicate what I did, if you'll duplicate the attitude that I have, then you'll know what I'm all about. He said, if I can do it to you, you can do it to anybody, because the servant's not greater than his master. Jesus is asking these men to give up their very most precious thing, which is their own ego and their own pride. There are a lot of people who read this literally. That'd be too cheap, too easy. What he's really asking for us to say is, we empty ourselves so that Jesus can work through us. That's the servanthood of this. It's not about washing feet. It's about letting Jesus wash feet with us and through us. So Jesus goes on to say, now that you've seen this and you've experienced it and you understand it, because what you do, if you've seen me do it, you do it to other people. If you've seen me serve this way, you serve that way too. It finally ends up this way. When he had gone out, Jesus says, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him at once. Little children, yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me. And just as I said to the Jews, so now I also say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you're my disciples, if you have love one for another. Jesus comes in that moment and says, let me give you a new commandment. The word new means something that supersedes everything else. It's something that's better, something that eclipses whatever was there before. The love the world has is the world to manipulate, the love that says, I'll love you if you love me back, or if you treat me right, I'll love you. We love our friends and hate our enemies. That was the standard. It's the modern standard as well. That's the world standard. Yet he says, I'm going to give you a new command, one that's different and better and eclipses anything you've heard before. It's a word that describes in Revelation chapter 21, a new heaven and a new earth. It is different. So he says, I give you this new commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. See, the standard is not that you figure out what love is. It is you look at Jesus and you love like he does. And if you love like he does, you will love one another because he loves people. He loves them in a way that can't be missed. Then he says this, by this all men will know that you're my disciples. It is the distinguishing characteristic of Christianity that you will love even to your death. You will give all that you have because the Lord gave everything he had. You follow him into this love of humanity and people in ways that nobody else can. We would like to think it's our worship that makes us different, or our Bible knowledge that makes us different. That's not what Jesus says. Jesus says, by this you'll know that if you love one another. The extreme love we have for the most unlovable, the same kind of love he had for the most unlovable, meaning us, that makes the difference in this world. By this, all will know. Jesus is tying up loose ends. So let's tie up a few loose ends of our own. What have we looked at in this lesson today? Well, first loose end is the loose end of the glory. What is the glory of God? It's Jesus, who is God come in flesh. If you don't believe him, you cannot believe in God, for Jesus is the glory of God. He's the presence and power of God. And so you cannot have this dual situation that says God is over here and he's powerful, Jesus over here, he's not. If you believe God, you're going to believe Jesus. If you believe Jesus, you're going to believe God. That's where the glory is. The second thing is, if you reject him, your heart's going to be in darkness. You'll be the Judas of life, in which you are looking out for yourself and no one else. And you'll go out and they will say of you, it was night. And finally, if you follow him, you'll do as he did, even to the point of death. We don't establish the standards of discipleship. We don't decide what following him looks like. We'd like to, but we can't. If you follow me, you'll follow me all the way to the cross. You'll be washing feet. You'll be serving the hurting. You'll be loving those who hate you. That's what it means to be a disciple of Christ. The only question for us is, do we really want to follow that badly? Next week, we're going to continue this discussion as Jesus continues to wrap up loose ends, to pray, to tell his Father what he would like when he leaves this earth. So I hope you'll join me then. I appreciate you being with me. I hope you've had an enjoyable time as we studied together, and I'll see you again next week. Have a great day.